don't show the monster too much at the beginning. You want the audience to get glimpses and hints of the monster so that the audience creates in their own mind, each member of the audience creates their individual monster.
Okay, this is good. I can see the top of the set. Nothing up our sleeves.
Last night, I had the strangest dream.
To me, the house is a woman's body. The hallways, the stairways, the corridors are the vagina. I, as a teenage boy, am immensely desirous of penetrating those hallways, yet at the same time, I am a little bit fearful about the journey. Perhaps it begins even earlier, at birth. The baby emerges from the safety, the warmth, and the darkness of the womb, travels down the birth canal, and emerges into the light, into the greatness and the terror of life.
That the real reality, in that sense, then, is the interior reality.
The real and true reality is the interior reality.
All right, this is the place, right here, in what was once an old lumber yard on Main Street in Venice, California. Depending on who you ask, it's a factory, it's a magic workshop, it's a house of dreams, it's a sweatshop. It's the world's greatest film school. It's a movie studio. It's Roger Corman's Concord Studios. It's kind of funny for me to be back here. I haven't actually been away from it really long enough to become nostalgic. But I'm getting there, especially for the planes going by. We're going to take a little visit here, try to get inside the mind of the man who gave us films like Bucket of Blood, Little Shop of Horrors, X, the Man with X-Ray Eyes, Creature of the Haunted Sea, The Premature Burial, The Pit and the Pendulum, The Wild Angels, The Trip, Von Richthofen and Brown, and so many, 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 many more. We're going to talk to him, find out about how he made them, maybe even find out about why he made them, and why he still does.
Probably the movies that made the biggest impression on me were the Westerns and the film noir. I loved the Westerns of John Ford and Howard Hawks and a number of other directors. And I also liked the very hard, tough films. And I can't remember all the directors, although Howard Hawks was one of them, but the stars, such as Humphrey Bogart and John Garfield and so forth.
That makes a lot of sense to me, especially the old Westerns that were all shot on natural locations, something that you did a lot in the films then that you directed. But the noirs, which like a lot of your films, were tough, small, didn't have a lot of money, very dark, and they particularly often had really bleak endings, which is something you also like.
It isn't so much that I like bleak endings. I believe, maybe from my own experience, that events do not always have happy endings.
But it's something that became standard in the 70s, but in part because you got away with it in the 50s and 60s, of bleak, existential, tough endings that Hollywood ordinarily doesn't like.
That may be partially my own worldview, but it's also the fact that as independents, I think we must do something different than the major studios, and therefore having the freedom to step away from the standard happy ending gives us a lot of opportunity to find new ways to work with film.
That's interesting, because that's always been, from a commercial standpoint, the definition of the independent picture. Its niche is to give the audience what the big studio can't. That might be sex, when the studio couldn't give you sex. It could be violence, when the studio couldn't really give you violence. But you seem to be suggesting it also meant we could give you a tougher, more realistic, more radical view of the world, which the studios also couldn't give us, if that was another exploitable element, in a sense.
It's partially an exploitable element, but it's also the fact that the studios, being essentially the establishment, and as such, tend to give you an establishment viewpoint. As the independents, as the rebels, we not only tend to, but I think want to give an alternative viewpoint.
Sort of appropriate with the Carnosaur poster behind you, but there's the dinosaurs starting to die out. as the Ice Age or whatever is coming, and there's the wily, furry little mammals running around at their feet who are going to not only make it, but become, in effect, the next dominant form. So that, in a sense, that was you. You were the furry little mammal scurrying around there at the feet of the dinosaurs right then.
I could see opportunities in what the majors were not doing. Particularly, I could see the fact that they were making very expensive films for an older audience. They had older actors. They would have a leading man in his 50s making love to a leading lady in her 40s because they were the great stars. Right. Whereas I could look around and see that the audience were teenagers. And it was fairly obvious to me, and I don't know why, not to the major studios, that if I had a teenage leading man and a teenage leading lady, the audience would go to see those films. That was only one factor. Right. It was also the youth movement that I would make films that would appeal more to young people rather than the, frankly, middle-aged type of film being made by the majors.
Now, I don't know, is there some connection here? Is this a progression on what we were talking about before of kind of the sexual, erotic nature of the horror films and to have gone from the sort of more gothic, subtle treatment of that to just the out-and-out strip bar also combined with a kind of slasher movie, like that somehow the times have gotten so much rougher that the old gothic teasing is not enough?
It may well be, because when I was doing the Poe films and the other gothic horror films in the 60s, I was working very much psychologically and by indirection. Starting in the 70s and 80s, directors were getting the same effect by cutting off an arm and letting blood scream across the screen. So I think things have gotten a little more overt.
Somehow you saw, it seems to me, that there was a connection between laughing and screaming. And that seems to me, again, to be one of the huge innovations. And again, something which is what big movies do today. They make people scream and laugh at the same time. And to do that, you have to recognize they come from the same place.
My theories were, and still are, that there is a vague connection between horror, between sex, and between comedy.
This wasn't just a critical theory from the outside. This was a theory that told you something about how to construct a scary scene.
A typical way to do it, and of course there are many, many ways to do it, a typical way is a very, to me, obviously sexual scene, which is a man or a woman moving down a corridor searching for something so that the tension builds and the audience is saying, consciously or unconsciously, and I've heard audiences speak back to the film, and they're partially saying, walk or run down that corridor and find out what the secret is at the end, and at the same time they're saying, get out of that house right away and don't have anything to do with it.
I mean, and you've often talked about that in a very psychological way. You say, as you said to us before, the house is a woman.
To me, the house represents a woman's body. The door, the windows, and particularly the hallways, the stairways, and so forth, represent the vagina. And the process, the concept, is the moving through the vagina to something wonderful. Yet at the same time, and particularly to a young teenage boy who doesn't have that much experience, it is also a little fearful.
Now, I know that you came to this in a way, or came to this thinking, around the time you were doing the Poe films. Now, by normal standards, this was still early in your life. You were a young man at this point, probably in your late 20s, early 30s?
Yes.
Of course, you had probably already made 30 films at that point.
Right.
You'd probably already made more films at that point in your life than most of us, even if we're fortunate enough to keep working, will ever make in our entire lives. But by the time you get ready to do the Poe films, you have achieved a level of not just competence. You had become in command of that craft, and something seems to happen in those films. There is a kind of quantum leap in those films. That as good as the films leading up to it are, there is something special in those films. I mean, you must have been aware of this at the time to some extent.
I believe there was at least some sort of a jump, starting with the very first of the Poe films, The Fall of the House of Usher. One was simply a technical and economic jump. I had never in my life shot a film on more than a 2-week schedule. On The Fall of the House of Usher, I had a 3-week schedule. I felt I was in nirvana. I could take my time, and truly I could experiment a little bit more. I could set up more interesting and intricate shots. I could do better work. At the same time, I was in analysis, was learning a little bit more about myself, was learning a little bit more about psychology, and was reading a great deal on the subject. So I was able to put together the fact that I had greater tools to work with on the set, and hopefully, if I want to continue the analogy, more tools or instruments to work with in my mind.
Tell me more about that, because I'm both, without revealing what was really going on the couch, I'd like to know what was coming up and how did that attach itself to Poe and to this lush and Baroque and Gothic feel of those films?
I think Poe in the 19th century was exploring psychologically what Freud was doing a little bit later in the 19th century scientifically, or at least medically, which was dealing with the concept of the unconscious mind. The feeling that there is an exterior world which we see around us and an interior world that propels us, but of which we are either not aware or only dimly aware.
And similarly in Usher, and I believe in some of the other films in this series, you never show us normal reality, in effect, exterior reality. It's always as if it's already been deformed by the mind of the protagonist.
My theory was the unconscious mind can't see anything. The eyes are connected essentially to the conscious mind. So the unconscious mind creates its own interior world.
And that the real reality, in that sense then, is the interior reality.
The real and true reality is the interior reality.
So many films I'd like to stop and talk about, but one of them that we must talk about is The Trip. Because again, we're talking about a film that takes place in some ways inside the mind. Now I know, I don't know if it's generally known, but you did some very serious research for The Trip.
Yes, I was a very hard-working and believing director, and I felt if I was going to do a film about LSD, simply as research, and maybe because I just wanted to do it, I took an LSD trip. I went up to Big Sur, and I had a spectacularly good trip.
Chuck Griffith has described your LSD trip and said that you spent most of the time lying face down on the ground saying, the earth is a woman, and I am humping her.
That is partially true, but there was one additional thought. I thought I had come up with a great new art form. I felt that, it's true, I went to this beautiful place, Big Sur, took the LSD and immediately laid down and looked at the ground and never looked at the ocean and the trees or anything else.
Well, again, interestingly, you're not looking at the landscape, you were going in here.
Right.
You were going inside.
And I had some sort of a feeling at the time that I could create something in my mind and be connected to the earth, and my creation would travel from me into the earth and then could be sampled by anyone else who is also connected to the earth. Now, this is not necessarily anything that was ever able to be put into practice, but at the time it seemed like a great idea.
Yeah, and very low production costs.
Right.
At this period, you're making what are radical films, stylistically. They're about radicals. they tended to influence and inspire a generation of radicals. And I'm particularly thinking of a kind of what almost might be considered a trilogy here of Wild Angels, The Trip, and probably Gas, if that's how it's said.
Yes.
Stunning films were truly the beginnings of really countercultural kinds of filmmaking, but also the beginning of the end, if not the outright end of your relation with AIP and attempting to do films for somebody else.
On each one of the films, after I finished them, they made increasingly large cuts in the film so that each film, when it came out, was roughly what I had made but had been changed a little bit.
But in each of these cases, there were not superficial cuts. They were things that went right to the heart of how radical the films were.
Yes, the final shot of the film really was one of, I felt, the most spectacular shots I ever had. I was shooting at the top of the Acoma Indian Pueblo in New Mexico, and I had a pullback shot starting on the boy and the girl kissing, just in a tight two-shot, and then pulling back to show the entire Acoma Indian tribe, the entire marching band of a local high school, the Hells Angels, the full chapter of the Hells Angels, and a number of presidents of the United States. I can't even remember everything in this shot. I mean, it was an incredible shot. And finally, all of them, because I was using a zoom lens for the first time combined with a crane, and all of them eventually dwarfed in the spectacular New Mexico landscape. I also introduced the character of God. I thought it was kind of funny and hip and somewhat meaningful. They cut God out throughout the film and cut out possibly the best shot I ever made and just ended with the beginning of the shot and the boy and the girl kissing, and that was the end of it. And that was indeed the last picture I directed for AIP.
You also shifted away from directing yourself and to the beginnings of what would become New World and later Conquer New Horizons, and the raising and training, in effect, of generations of young filmmakers. Why did you lay down your camera? It's like Prospero putting down the wand there at that point and deciding to just produce other magicians.
I was a little bit discouraged about what had happened with Gas, and I just became incredibly tired shooting von Richthofen and Brown. I had shot too many films too fast, and I was just getting tired.
Okay. See, this is the real treasure stuff here. This is the real money in the bank. Roger owns almost every picture he did. It's funny, you're used to seeing films on the screen, and it's just the images in which you remember them. But in the end, it's these, right? It's the cases. Look out here. Oh, dusty. It's like in the Gothic castle. We got Babyface Nelson, Jack Nicholson. Oh, down here we got a couple of my classics. Carnosaur. There's a brain dead print. Body Waves, Manhunt, Bloodfist. Bad. Black Rose of Harlem. Oh, yeah. Yep, there's another one of my. Oh, look at that. I love that. I've got Body Chemistry 2. I did that one. Right next to Roger's Little Shop of Horrors. Caddo Lake, Earl Franklin's film. Oh, and look at this. Here, see? This is Corman Essence. Ingmar Bergman's Autumn Sonata, right next to Battle Beyond the Stars. That's Roger. I mean, who else would have taken Bergman and released him in drive-ins all across the country?
Then, unfortunately, at the end, you really have to show the monster,
Show the damn thing.
but you postpone that moment as long as you can.
Yeah, but this could be related back to your sexual theory of the horror film, too, that the foreplay is often better than the finale, right? So I guess that's true for another comparison between the act of lovemaking and the creature film.
It's true of many things.
I don't think in the end any filmmaker will actually tell you who they are. It doesn't matter what questions you ask. If you want to know who they are, you're going to have to look at the films. And I think if you look at Roger's films, you can find him all over the place. I think he's Roderick Usher, the ultra-sensitive intellectual driven mad. I think he's Ray Milland in X, the man with X-ray eyes who wants to see right through the world and ends up seeing straight through out to the other side of reality. Of course, he's Seymour Krelboyne with his magic blood-drinking, flesh-eating plant that makes him a millionaire until it does him in. Or the would-be wannabe beatnik artist in Bucket of Blood who desperately wants to be in with the in crowd. wants to be a real artist, and only becomes one accidentally when he finds that the people he kills make good sculptures. Or he's Peter Fonda in Wild Angels, the rebel who won't quit, who is having an orgy at a funeral. Or Peter Fonda again in The Trip. He's a commercials director who, dissatisfied with the lack of artistic integrity in his work, decides to tune in, turn on, and drop out. Or perhaps mostly the contradiction is seen in the last real film he directed, in a way, Von Richthofen and Brown, a terrific World War I picture made for peanuts. In it, the great elite artist, the Baron von Richthofen, who's kind of a fighter for a fighter's sake, an artist for art's sake, is pitted against the humble, thrifty, industrious, hard-working, somewhat hustling American George Brown, and is ultimately shot down by him. Sometimes I think that might really be Roger, both of them, that the sort of great elite artist that he might have been was ultimately shot down by the hard-working, hustling, brilliant, pragmatic businessman that he was. But of all those images, there's one that I think of most encapsulates Roger. And it's, of course, the end of the film that's one of my favorites, and one that he himself has called his most personal. It's The Creature from the Haunted Sea. And it's one of those films, maybe the only film in the history of movies practically, where the monster wins. At the end of the film, you get this wonderful shot of this monster sitting at the bottom of the sea, squatting on top of the bones and bodies of the people he's killed in a huge chest of gold. And the monster's sitting there actually smiling. And I think in a way that's Roger. I think in a way he is a monster. He's a fabulous monster, a nurturing and devouring mother who has lived off his children for years. But none of us really mind. After all, he gave birth to us. We are his children. We're all little monsters, just like him. Thanks, Roger.